Good day, everyone. I'm privileged to be in the company of our documentary filmmaker, the director, writer, producer of A Rustling of Leaves, done in 1988, and now it comes home to the Philippines 32 years after, in its first official or it's a premiere in this country. My name is Roland Tolentino, and I'll be moderating this conversation, this Q&A with our filmmaker, Nettie Wild. So, Nettie, would you first like to do some greetings here?
Well, first of all, I wish that I could be in the Philippines. It's only a pandemic that keeps me away, believe me, from getting on a plane and being. I actually had a flight booked in March.
Wow.
So I would so love to be there, and I just want to, really dedicate all these screenings, all these downloads that are going to happen, to a really extraordinary bunch of Filipinos who reached out to me and said yes instead of no to my camera and my naive outsider questions, and together. We made something that appears to be lasting because people tell me that they think it may resonate. So, how I wish I could be there. Yeah.
Well, viewing it now, 32 years after, there's still a heavy feeling with the kinds of issues still resonating up to the present. The red tagging, the privatization of violence, from the military to some other kinds of groups being endorsed by the military, then the paramilitary groups or the fanatical religious organizations that were mobilized for anti-communism. And then the cast of characters, both from the left and extreme right, pondering on this idea of a kind of political landscape that they envision for this country, and the violence, the consequences of violence that's still here. What were your motivations for doing this kind of serious films rather than you could have done something more topical in the cities and from a safer kind of perspective?
Well, I had this extraordinary experience before actually picking up a camera, and that's that I came to the Philippines originally as an actress, and I had a Canada Council grant to research Filipino popular theater. I was invited by PETA to come to the Philippines and take a look at many, many different forms of really exciting theater that was happening in the streets or in the sugarcane fields. Mm-hmm. And so I did that. And when I was in Mindanao, I was with this terrific Filipina actress, and the two of us were approached. We got this note that came to us in a variety of ways, and said, would you like to come up into the mountains and create a play for the 17th anniversary of the New People's Army? And I was naive, and I didn't really understand the context of this. And I said, of course. And we ended up going up into the mountains. And I think I carried with me all the stereotypes that you can imagine. I come from an extremely conservative family, a real martini belt family where my mother was slightly to the right of Attila the Hun. She was, this would have been terrifying for her. Mm-hmm. And when eventually we came into camp, and I slid into camp, having slid my way for the last 3 hours on this extraordinary mud, and it was holding on to the side of this hut. This very dapper, small man who spoke perfect English welcomed me to the northeast of Mindanao. And in getting to know him, I realized that he had been going through for his degree in agricultural engineering. And in the process of that, he had led demonstrations against clear-cut logging. And for that, he had earned himself a place on a list that you never want to get on. And his bishop had come to him one night and said he'd seen this list and he had a decision to make. He would either stay legal and face most probable imprisonment or worse, or he should go underground. And he had to make that decision. He went into the mountains, and I met him 17 years later. I come from a province in British Columbia where clear-cut logging is everywhere. And all of us had cut our teeth as young political activists on protesting clear-cut logging. And I looked at this guy and I was so stunned because I thought, holy smokes, I'm looking at somebody who, if I had been born Filipina, was there a possibility that I could have been you? You who, to my mother, was the devil incarnate, right? A revolutionary, barefoot, Asian, long hair, carrying a gun, communist. And that led me into a series of informal interviews with the Hukbalahap up there, just trying to figure out who they were. Where'd you come from? Who were your parents? What did you do? How did you end up here? And at first, the Revolutionary Army was, they were alarmed. They just wanted us to make a play. They didn't want me nosing around talking to people about their backgrounds. And eventually, this man who I'd met really understood what my curiosity was. And that maybe there was a voice there who could take a story out that would be listened to. And so when many, many things happened during that trip, and when at one point we were just about to have the performance, and just as we were to begin, all of a sudden we heard this, and Paloi, who you'll meet in the film, people will meet in the film, came running past me, and his nickname to me was Oya, which was grandmother, because I was all of 34 years old, which made me the second oldest person in the entire front. And he said, Oya, forget the play. This is the real thing. Run. And we were under attack. And so for 4 days, we retreated into the mountains, and I actually saw how the communities supported that guerrilla army. And it was just a door through which I walked that I don't think many people like me had that opportunity, you know. And so when I walked out of the mountains, I carried with me a film proposal that I had written up on onion skin paper, and it was folded up into a very small piece that I could fit into my shoe. And in it was an agreement that if I could go back to Canada and raise the money and get a crew based on no experience whatsoever, but having this extraordinary access, that if I could do that I would come back and make this film. But there was a condition that I made. And the condition was that this man and that unit would have to allow me to film two of the most contentious things, a military action and a people's court, because I just knew in my naive gut that if I made a piece of propaganda, it would be a terrible waste of everybody's time, that we had to go into the contradictions that these people faced as well. And if they would allow me to do that, I had this sense that I had a very surprising story to tell people, perhaps in the Philippines and definitely outside. And that's what really drove me the entire time, was just trying to get behind the hearts and minds of not just the people in the mountains, but then as the cast of characters grew, I realized, I think what this film, the curiosity of this film has to be me as an outsider looking in and saying, if if I was a Filipino, what would I do to bring about what Ed de la Torre refers to as a good democracy? Would I go up into the mountains like the commander that I had met? Or would I fight through the legal left? And what we discovered was either way, you were going to be attacked by the right-wing paramilitary. And that became the political triangle that we built A Rustling of Leaves around. And of course, we discovered that the people in the civil society were in fact at more risk than people in the mountains because they were unarmed. And those ideas that they carried were making them targets. So it just kept going and going. It was a huge learning experience for me. So that was why.
How did you offer this project in Canada and elsewhere? There's a lot of groups that supported this project, especially. But how were you able to bring them in? Especially, you did not, as you mentioned, you did not have that kind of film or documentary background. You just had this a vacuum in your heart that you wanted to be filled out. How did you make it work?
It was the stories. First of all, it was the stories that I came out with in my shoe. I was able to say, if these people are still alive, I have this kind of access. Also, before Ninoy Aquino was killed, the Philippines, nobody knew where it was. And there were just beginning to be kind of migrant workers coming here. Now Filipinos are looking after our mothers and fathers. We have this huge Filipino population. But at that time, there were, we did a play actually about the Philippines before I came over. We really didn't know what we were talking about, but we did our best. And I remember we used to have to put a map out in the lobby and show where the Philippines was. And we were doing a play about the military armaments that we were, the nuclear reactors that Canada were selling to Marcos at that time. Then Ninoy Aquino was assassinated. And in that terrible moment, the Philippines literally exploded onto our screens because of the very public way that happened. And then the phenomena of Cory started to build. And so there I was coming up with another story. A lot of people covering the woman in the little yellow dress and the democratic movement building around her. But then I'm coming up with this other story that nobody was talking about, but it referenced a country that was really starting to be on the rise. But the big thing was that I really, really rooted my proposal in these extraordinary, I thought, human stories that were unexpected and surprising because, a communist army here, us being so heavily influenced by the United States, is just an anathema. And so to be able to show that kind of a character was galvanizing. And then once we got our rushes, we just got enough money to shoot. And then when we got our rushes, I put them together and I showed people what we had. And we showed them a snippet of Dante on the campaign trail. And we showed them a snippet of the brilliance of Ed de la Torre, kind of being able to synthesize something with incredible humor and intelligence. And we showed them June Pala, which totally blew their minds, right? As he's threatening to use the tactics of Goebbels on people. And of course, the portraits of people in the mountains. And that's what really pushed us into getting enough funding to getting it finally funded, because people went, whoa, we've never seen this before.
One of the things that struck me in your film was that the assemblage of characters that you've chosen to focus the documentary in order to tell the story about the Philippine Revolution. which means that you had right wing and left wing personalities coming in, and in both kinds of political spectrum, the humanity of both personalities, I mean, from both those spectrums come out. June Pala, the red tagging, anti-communist radio personality, even though he was just interviewed in his booth, no, still came out as someone who's kind of intelligent, who's kind of charismatic, whose voice apparently resonates with a lot of other, with probably hundreds of thousands of his listeners. And on the other hand, you had Bernabe Buscaino, freed out of prison after X number of years of being detained in solitary confinement, and then looking into the clouds. And it's only
hoping.
Hope was that during his campaign trail was that in the middle of his lunch or afternoon sort of forays, that a cloud would suddenly cover the sun and allow a respite from that kind of heat. So you were able to capture this moment. I could just imagine the footage and the determination to really capture that kind of moment, which is something historical, no? In two fronts. Now, first was that you clearly had a sense of the political, the things even with Cory will not change or have slid back to the kind of the kinds of terror, state terror during the Marcoses. And second is that these characters, these personalities, whether they're there or someone else takes their place, eventually 32 years after, are still very much present in the landscape of Philippine politics and in the daily lives of the people. Now, was it gut feel or instinct that drew them close to you, or and what was the patience of having to cover everything?
Well, that's terrifying. That's terrifying if you think you have to cover everything. And also, I think it was, I relied so heavily on Filipinos who said yes instead of no, not just to being in front of my camera, but helping me behind the scenes. And so it took over 100 people in the Philippines and Canada to make a Rustling of Leaves. And there was this tight group of people who helped me, not only in terms of political or literal translation, but political translation, cultural translation. And so together we're solving this problem. And it's a very, very fluid situation, right? So that I became familiar with in terms of future films where you have to change gears as you're filming. You think you're going for this, and then that turns into something quite different. But the thing that helps a film, I think, be wise and move out of those naive outsider eyes is the insiders who helped us hugely. And it was hard because all I knew was as a storyteller, as an actress who had come from the world of drama, is that we had to find people who were willing to let us film when they were vulnerable. And that's very, very hard. And the only thing I could say to them is, why would you do that to me, an outsider, to my camera? Why would you allow that? And the only thing I could say is, here's my instinct, is that if you allow us in to show us what your battles are, not just the public face, but the things that really keep you awake at night, your fears, that will connect to people outside. They will lean into the camera as opposed to just having a bunch of polite interviews with people wagging their finger and heaping rhetoric on us. And so that meant that I had to convince Dante and the Partido ng Bayan to allow us to travel with them during this really, really, to say it was a contested campaign. There were people dying during this campaign. And there was actually a point when Dante went totally cold on us, like just completely turned. And later, when he warmed up again, I went, "What happened?" He said, "Well, somebody told me you were CIA." Right. So that was it wasn't easy. And certainly even getting up into the mountains was really difficult. Because of what I'd been through with the New People's Army, with that particular unit, we had shared a human experience. The Communist Party leadership hadn't shared that experience. And they're going, "Who's going up into the mountains? Who is she? What?" And so there was a real conflict there. With June Pella, I had this very strong sense that, he loved performing.
Right.
He loved being filmed, right? So we spent not just one time with him, but hours, days. We returned. And sure enough, he opened up, and it was really surprising what he was saying. But at the same time, we were following the story of the labor organizers there, and a man who is threatened on air and then is killed. And so we come back to Pella with that link. You threatened him on air and he ends up dead. And at that point, he makes it very clear in no uncertain terms that our access is over. And he says, "I will kill even the media." At which point, our lights had heated up his station so much that the glass that surrounded it cracked with just this loud crack, and it was like a gun went off, and my cameraman jumped, and we got out of town.
That part of the film.
Well, it was because you couldn't hear it or see it because we were running.
Oh,
we were getting out. But anyway, so it was when you ask, "Oh, how do you get to those moments?"
Mm-hmm.
You earn them, but you earn them with a group of pretty extraordinary people. And I have to mention at this point, Jojo Sescon, who started off as our assistant cameraman, and ended up, he was the only person who would go up into the mountains with me to film. My Canadian crew drew the line. They said, "We'll do everything, but we're not going up there." And Jojo went with me. And Jojo's not only extraordinarily brave and a great human being, but he has a lovely eye. And so that's the kind of support I'm talking, real, concrete, extraordinary support from people like Jojo and others.
But part of the reality of your documentary is that you were filming under duress, which means that Paolo was threatening you. And I wouldn't know how to react if I was being threatened by him while your filmmakers were shooting your film, or in the middle of an offensive or by the both military and the NPA. You were caught in that kind of line of fire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what was it like? What did you need to tell yourself or about these kinds of dangers while making your film, that you might not end up alive after the shoot?
Well, I can tell you that the fear was so intense that it tasted like the taste of metal. So it was very real. On the other hand, I knew that people around us were facing much more. And so it was really important that whatever I was up to or whatever fear I felt, that I didn't increase the odds of people around me becoming more vulnerable. And most of the time that worked, but it didn't with Paloy. And he was a young Hook Balahap who I had befriended early on. He was a fantastic actor in a play that we put on. He had a terrific sense of humor. He had a high voice. He took the lyrics from Balaling and turned it into a revolutionary song. He was as young as I was old. And he lost his life defending our film crew.
Was he the radio man mentioned in your
film? He's the radio man. Yeah, and we shared radio English. That's how we communicated. Over and out, he used to say when he'd leave camp. So I think that's, and Jojo was put in an extraordinary situation. He was in even more danger than I was when we were up in the mountains. And also because he was a Filipino. And this is something that was very, very, that I had to realize over and over again, was that I just had to make sure that we got this film shot and we got it out of the country, and you know, we didn't create more danger for people who are already so very vulnerable. And then I have to admit to something that is not, you know, I don't know how quite to put it, but I was also really terrified that I wasn't going to get the story, that it was so complex and there were so many things breaking all the time that you kind of want to shoot everything that moves, right? But you can't. So you have to make choices. And a lot of times you're halfway through filming something and something happens and you have to drop the camera and run. You have to do many, many different things. So I was really, another huge fear, which was a much more, you know, kind of existential fear, is that I was going to come out of the mountains having put, and not just the mountains, but on the campaign trail and everywhere else where we were, having put a lot of people at risk, and I wouldn't be able to deliver something that would reach out and show a heart that was beating on the other side of the world. And that terror I lived with until we locked picture. And I realized these stories are huge and they're going to resonate.
I've been told that I should ask the last question. And
that's a bummer.
Right. I was kind of hoping to ask you something about the General Bato in your film, De La Rosa, who's a prominent senator now, and how he started off, at least in your film, as a kind of a vanguard of the paramilitary groups in that part of Mindanao. Also, as other characters that might have been there, like President Duterte. I would have wanted to ask you this question, but probably as a last question, the thing I want to also be enlightened with is that how did this film kind of shape your vision of documentary filmmaking, or your commitment towards documentary in the years to come? Because your life has been focused, after A Rustling of Leaves, towards creating socially aware kinds of documentaries, whether in Canada or in Mexico or elsewhere.
Well, A Rustling of Leaves really formed me. It really taught me. Philippines taught me a huge amount. I really learned on a really gut level that that you're not doing anyone any favors if you make propaganda, that you have to, as difficult as it is, you have to ask people to be vulnerable in ways that they haven't before, perhaps on camera, to allow your camera to film them and then prepare them for the fact that you're going to be filming the so-called other side. And the reason is because you're going to make people sit up and go, I wonder if I could be that person. That's the trick. That's where you want to get the audience to, as opposed to just being lectured at and therefore they sit back and drop you and your movie, and it just turns into a kind of polarized rhetoric. So that was a really strong lesson. The other thing that I learned was that in the Philippines, people used to say to me, oh, the Philippines is really complicated. Really, really complicated. And then I would go to Mexico and they'd say the same thing. And then I'd go to Northern Canada and they'd say, oh, you know, First Nations politics is really complicated. And I realized it's the complexity. It was incumbent on me to not go, oh, this story is too complicated for people to understand. But if there was a complexity, dive into it. If there was a contradiction that I didn't understand, nose into it. Because in those contradictions, you would find the contradictions that people on a village level are living, right? And so it pulls you away from propaganda and it leads you to surprise. If you can take a curious lens, instead of making up my mind ahead of time, what I was going to find, just be really prepared to be surprised and then go with that surprise. And then that leads you to extraordinary people. Dante was a national figure, a kind of obvious person to follow, but some of the not so obvious people in A Rustling of Leaves are the real surprises. And so that really cemented a very difficult way of working, because it's way easier just to go in and allow people just to sit down and give you the headlines. But if you can actually get behind that and allow them to get off their chair and actually follow them into their lives, it's pretty extraordinary. And I guess finally, a lot of people have said that I make political documentaries, and I argue that they're high stakes human dramas, and that what I try to do is to get my camera to a place where people, no matter what, are going to act, that they're at that point where they have to act to move forward. And it's in that action that I have something to film. You can make great books about political theses, and you can get people talking about what they're doing. But if you can show through cinematic action what people are doing, whether that's the everyday life of a guerrilla camp that people have never seen before, or the fragments of a political campaign that was so wound up like a piano wire with tension, where these people were allowing themselves to go unarmed right into paramilitary territory that was after them, and find the humanity in the little moments in that, you've got something that will resonate. And the first big screening that A Rustling of Leaves had was the Berlin International Film Festival. And I walked into a cinema of 2,500 people. And when it was over, they just rose like one. It was extraordinary. And it wasn't for me. It was because of the stories that they'd seen on that screen.
So many thanks, Nettie. And I hope the Daang Dokyu remains kind of regular presence in the Philippines by way of establishing itself as a regular documentary film festival. And I hope down the line we get to see your films, your other films too. Nettie,
I'd love it.
As a kind of showcasing of how other documentary filmmakers also magnify or represent the stories in other parts of the world. And as a kind of since your film will be shown, will be open for screening in a couple of days, would you like to invite everyone to your film at 32 years after?
Yeah. 32 years after we shot. Yes, I invite everybody to not only look at it, but maybe bring somebody who is on the complete opposite side of the issue than you are, and see if A Rustling of Leaves, how it resonates with that person. And I'm so curious to know. I'd love people to get in touch with me and tell me whether or not this rustling stands, whether or not it feels like it provide some kind of a backstory to what's happening now, if it does that, or whatever you think. And a special shout out to all the people who appeared on camera and behind camera. I hope they too take another look at rustling and own it, because without you, boy, it wouldn't have been made.
Thank you, Nettie, and thank you, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.